Hi, I'm Steve Hassan, and I'm delighted to have Russ Bellant with me today. Russ and I go back decades. He's been researching the right wing for decades and decades, and I believe we talked when I got out of the Moonies I got out in '76, but I think we talked in the early '80s and such. And Russ, I've always respected your research, and I really reached out and I said, Russ, we want to hear what your thoughts are on what's happening today and the situation, and any recommendations you might have. So we're all ears.
Well, thank you kindly. I think there's a under serious under mis lack of understanding of the phenomenon of and the ideology and the extent of right wing movements in this country. And even today, I'm not sure how many people understand when you say Nazi, what that really means. They know it's negative, but um, you know, one of the quick points I want to make on that is that in 1991, Vanity Fair ran an interview with Trump's ex-wife from his first marriage, and she laid out a number of interesting things about Donald Trump. She talked about how um, uh, when a cousin of his um, would come into his office to meet with him, he would give him a Heil Hitler salute, which did not offend Donald. That his the book he had for his bedside reading was Hitler's collected speeches. Um, and
I
the,
should add that I read that in preparation for writing The Cult of Trump.
oh, okay, okay.
So,
And um, even in 2016, when he was running for president, neither the Democratic Party or the mass media made any allusion to this incredible information that she was putting out about him. And, you know, he, was one to make statements about his good German blood and so forth, even though people generally don't know that his grandfather was barred from being in Germany because he had conducted so many, uh, you know, uh, let's say he was a bad actor when he was in North America, Canada, and the United States, and they decided he was unworthy of returning to Germany, even though he had been a German citizen. To the degree that citizenship was a real thing back in Germany, Germany is a late bloomer in the world of nations, after all.
and I
But
think his family name was Drumpf, Drumpf, if I'm not
yes,
mistaken.
yeah, that sounds right. And so his father was a Ku Klux Klan member. The New York Times did a report in the early 20s. I'm going to say 1922, 23. Did a report that named Fred Trump and gave his address, so there's no two Fred Trumps that can be confused, as a Klan member who had been arrested fighting New York City police over a rally that they were trying to conduct. And apparently about 1,000 Klansmen in Brooklyn,
Hmm.
were involved in this. This is a period of time when if those of us who've seen the movie The Gangs of New York, they were actively organizing to try and stop non-Nordic peoples from coming into the United States.
Hmm.
And their target for the Klan then was in New York was the Poles, Jews, Irish, and Mediterranean folks from Mediterranean countries such as Italy and Greece and Spain, and that's Fred Trump's background.
Hmm.
The whole time he expanded his business, and he is a real estate and developer type of guy and a big landlord. And he was so bad that he absolutely barred without qualification any black occupant of any of his housing. and that's how Donald Trump was raised, and
Mm-hmm.
Donald never had any issue with that at all, ever. And you know, the uh, his his reputation was so bad that I'm trying to remember the name of the folk singer who wrote uh,
Arlo Guthrie.
Bill Guthrie, yeah. I was, wrote a song called "Old Man Trump," I think it was,
Yes,
and
exactly.
the guy he was. So you know that existed, and you can blame voters for voting for him, but you also have to look at the institutions, the competing parties and candidates, the media. I don't think there's anybody who's really did the job in 2016 that needed to be done to explain what Donald Trump was.
I know
Um,
David K. Johnson tried. He was following him and writing about him, but yeah, it was a total failure of
yeah, yep,
responsible reporting.
yep. And so we get somebody who takes the office of the president and starts saying, that there's good folks in the Klan and the Ku Klux Klan and so forth, and not condemning the rallies where they murdered people who were against them, and the proliferation, and people are surprised, that they've got a lunatic for president,
Mm-hmm.
and so to me that you know that tells and even I published something in 2016 about this during the campaign through my just locally and there was I think a fairly widespread lack of curiosity about this, even when it was published in a timely manner.
Oh, I
But
read it when you put it out, of course. But the name of your book that came out in '88 and then got republished in '91, what is the title again?
it's called "Old Nazis, the New Right, and the Republican Party."
Yeah,
Uh,
that needs to be repeated. Could you just repeat it slower?
yeah, Old Nazis, the New Right, and the Republican Party.
And this
And
was
so,
1988, which is when Combating Cult Mind Control came out, my first book. You did an update later, but you
well,
were you were predicting, you were saying, look, this is what's happening now,
yes,
which was 1988.
yes. In the 1988 version, it was more. It was like a spiral bound report, uh, and it was called "Old Nazis, the New Right" in the Reagan administration,
I
because
see.
Reagan was still the president then, and it was renamed when we published the book in a slightly expanded format. Yes,
Hmm.
uh, and so "Old Nazis" referred to, basically, in summary, the Waffen SS survivors of the Waffen SS, people who are still alive, who were allowed to come into displaced person camps by the Allies, basically by the United States,
Hmm.
and were uh, were vetted, were known to, and they were allowed to even keep their networks intact inside the displaced person camps. So the Ukraine Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists, which marched into Ukraine in 1941 with the German troops and helped liquidate citizens that the Nazis didn't like Jews, Poles, and so forth, and continued that collaboration throughout World War II.
Hmm.
They came into the displaced person camps to escape the Red Army, which of course was their mortal enemy. And they had formed combat units to fight the Red Army, and the Bulgarian nationalists, the Bulgarian National Front, same story. The Romanian Iron Guard, the Hungarian Arrow Cross, the Croatian Ustashi, et cetera, et cetera, in various countries of the Baltic countries, Estonia, Lithuania, Latvia. They all had their gray wolves and various paramilitary units working with the Nazis. And they basically, by the tens of thousands, are brought into the United States.
Hmm.
Nazis.
Now, is this Operation Paperclip or is this something else?
This is something much broader. And Paperclip was focused on the scientists and the engineers, the technical, and often they were part of the German system. So they weren't displaced person camps as such.
Got it.
They American occupied zones. This was much broader, didn't have a project name so far as I could recall.
Mm-hmm.
And it was done on a case-by-case basis. And there was a point in 1950 where the displaced person camp commissioners, the displaced person camps were run by the Displaced Person Commission, which was formed in 1948 and lasted until 1952. And, entities that, we would come to know later were affiliated with intelligence agencies were, involved in these camps. And they were the ones that really vetted and pulled these people together and identified who would become American citizens, be brought into the United States. And in 1952, the Republican Party formed ethnic groups using these folks. I mean, it's not even clear how well their English was by then, to become part of present in ethnic communities. I know in Detroit, Hungarian Arrow Cross was moved into, and occupied parts of southwest Detroit, which had a Magyar church and was had a heavy Hungarian population during those days. And they came in with trying to be a heavy hand and so forth, and you can imagine they were widely rejected. But if you're a Republican that doesn't know anything about the emigre communities, and you're tied to a different part of the world, you think these folks are going to matter, and so they set them up to work in ethnic communities to bring ties to the Republican Party. And
can I interrupt you and ask? Was this more because they rationalized they needed to fight communism and these people would be allies, or was it more that there were actually, Hitler sympathizers already in the United States and they wanted, like-minded people here?
Well, I think it depends on who you talk to back then as to what their motivations.
Well, what's your take?
My take is two. One, in later years of World War II, the Allen Dulles, who headed OSS, which was the predecessor of the CIA, he headed the operations out of Bern, Switzerland, and Europe, and others, kind of reflecting the George Patton statement that we need to continue the war against the Soviet Union.
Mm-hmm.
And so they were recruiting all these groups because the American government did not have, on the ground intelligence and knew really what was going on in the customs, the history, and all this. And they wanted these folks who were fanatics to continue the war. And they can operations of various sorts. And they figured that, and Hungary was the model for this, that they could create uprisings with their networks, many of whom were still in the home countries. They didn't all go in person camps. Mm-hmm. They could create uprisings and overturn Communist Party rule in each of these countries. And the 1956 Hungarian uprising was their experimental model to do this. Mm-hmm. And that was heavily pushed and backed by the Radio Free Europe and Radio Liberty operations, which served as kind of communications arms for these groups. And so the same groups that were, had this history were also structured into the Radio Free Europe.
Yeah.
And the organization of Ukrainian nationalists and others. And that's why you'd see a lot of them would have addresses in Munich, which is where the Radio Free Europe was headquartered back then.
So interesting. So let's come closer into the Trump era and now what's happening now and your
Yeah.
the best
So
recommendations.
in 1968, Richard Nixon, who had been vice president when all these folks were recruited and networked and cultivated, and so he knew them, and he knew actually some of the leadership. He told the Republican National Committee chair, Laszlo Pastor, he said, if you guys help get me elected, I will make the Republican National Committee heritage groups a permanent, ongoing part of the Republican National Committee. So the Heritage Council became the operating ethnic arm of the Republican Party, and it was led by a Hungarian who had served in Berlin in World War II as a liaison between the Nazi regime and the Hungarian Arrow Cross, which was the Hungarian Nazi Party, which held, and Arrow Cross actually held power in the last year of the war because the previous government said, we're done with this war. And the Hungarian, they were going to surrender, and make peace with the Soviet Union. And because they saw the Red Army coming, they knew it was over with. And so they were going to make their peace. And so the Germans, and working with the Arrow Cross, overthrew that government and imposed their power. And the liaison between those two was Laszlo Pastor, who served after the war. He served a number of years in jail for crimes against humanity. Okay. And so he makes it to the displaced person camps and makes it to, or not to the camps, but he makes it to the United States. Let's just say it that way. And he takes this leadership role, or is given it to him. And so he chairs it, and the Bulgarian component of it is the Bulgarian National Front. The Arrow Cross is the Hungarian report. The Romanian Iron Guard is the Romanian component, et cetera, et cetera. You don't see anything in there that, when you talk about heritage groups, you think ethnic and, which has a conflated relationship with of race and ethnic identity. And there's nobody who's Jewish, no entity or person who's Jewish or African American that's part of this. Or, in my recollection, Palestinian. It's really focused on the Europeans and a few other folks, Taiwanese, Asian, but Chinese who are tied to the Kuomintang, which was the ruling dictatorial party of Taipei, which became known as Taiwan, or Taipei was the capital, in those periods of time. So you basically had a replication of some international networks that had been constructed and were being operated by the intelligence agencies, being manifest in this alliance, in this ethnic community. And that, but for the most part, it was dominated by the East Europeans who came out of the with a Nazi history. So he puts that together, and in post 1968, after Richard Nixon wins the election, he gets that going. And they, as you know, during that period of time, it was the height of the Vietnam War. So this served as an ethnic voice supporting the war in Vietnam, and fighting civil rights and so forth, and working in conjunction with Americans of a similar disposition. Now, to bring it back in a bit, I do a major part of the book. The second chapter is about the American Security Council and its offshoot arm, the Coalition for Peace Through Strength. The American Security Council supposedly existed to fight communism. But in the leaders of it who founded it, Robert Wood, who was the chairman of Sears Roebuck at the time out of Chicago, and others, Charles Lindbergh, they were decidedly pro-fascist and were against the United States being in World War II because they supported the goals of Germany, frankly.
Right.
And and these characters come together to and bring like-minded group like the American Coalition of Patriotic Societies. That is a group that was formed in 1927 to defend the National Origins Immigration Act. There was in the 1920s, again, going back to the gangs of New York stuff and the Donald Trump and the Klan, there was a concerted effort that was successful in 1924 to ban immigration of peoples, except in proportion to that how they already existed in the American population. So and it was openly stated that this is to preserve Nordic values. Nordic obviously is just a fairly narrow part of Europe, Scandinavia, Denmark, Germany, England. And so it would basically greatly restrict, say, Polish immigration, Irish immigration, and Italian immigration, and so forth. That was the intent. The American Coalition of Patriotic Societies was formed to preserve and extend that influence. And they became involved in supporting Nazi Germany. They were tied to the eugenics of Germany. They took the American eugenics work and shared it in Germany. Out of this, in 1937, was formed the Pioneer Fund, which was a foundation funded by a textile guy named Wycliffe Draper out of Massachusetts to fund research on that tried to prove the racial superiority of people that they thought were superior, and it funded many groups and their work. In the more modern times, the Federation for American Immigration Reform, which always said that they were not racist and so forth, but they were getting funded from groups that put race at the center of immigration.
Right.
And so this network survives through. Well, they show up in concert with the American Security Council, and in later years, the head of the American Security Council, John Fisher, was also the head of the American Coalition of Patriotic Societies. Despite this, even after World War II, the American Coalition of Patriotic Societies condemned the Nuremberg trials and worked for years to try and get all the people condemned for war crimes on the German side to be released from prison, which they said they were suffering imprisonment. This is the language. They were very openly still, pro-Nazi, frankly.
Yeah, of course.
Super racialist. And then this became a little more concretized in 1978 when the American Security Council, after Jimmy Carter was elected, and Jimmy Carter wasn't, despite being a submarine commander in the U.S. Navy of a nuclear submarine, was not very, keen on expanding the military. And in fact, while he was, as soon as he got to office, he started posing the question of, why do we need tens of thousands of nuclear weapons? Can't we reduce it to about 250? And they all had heart attacks about this, right? So American Security Council, which exists to lobby for higher military budgets and worked with the weapons manufacturers, the Lockheeds of the world and so forth, they formed this coalition with the intent of having this grassroots network to lobby for higher military spending and for harder line policies. And not so publicly to, support the intelligence agency efforts in the same direction.
And Russ, in your research, did you come across the Council for National Policy, or WACL?
Yes, I did. But I want to
please
take another minute on this Coalition for Peace Through Strength.
Please.
They're using all the front organizations of the Heritage Groups Council. You see the organization Ukrainian Nationalist Front groups. You see all these Nazi backgrounds. You see people who are getting funded by the Pioneer Fund for their racial work. The Council for American Affairs, which was headed by one of the foremost racialist Nazi propagandists in the world, he worked in Europe and the United States. He formed a Nordic group and was openly allied with the racial theoreticians of Nazi Germany that survived the war. And here they were, part of this coalition for peace through strength. They held in the late 50s. There were national conferences called military-industrial conferences in the last several years of the Eisenhower administration. And the representatives were there from Germany, were the people who were raising money out of the industrial sector for the Nazi Party. I mean, this stuff was just loony, right? So
yeah, they had a big rally in Madison Square Garden, I think, in the early 30s.
Yeah. I think it was probably in the later 30s, and even I think in 1940, you had very clear pro-Nazi elements in New York City, where in the Bund, which was the German-American Bund, was one of the outreaches they had. They had a presence in Detroit. I've gone to some of the properties and looked at some of the places where they were operating in Detroit. But they were all over Chicago. They were all over the industrial Midwest as well, and the West Coast. So, so this influence is not to be ignored. When you start looking at what is the base that brings Donald Trump to power, there was this long institution, and this Coalition for Peace Through Strength that had all these groups in it, and the American Security Council that undergirded and organized it. They were being funded by the military-industrial complex, as Eisenhower labeled it. General Eisenhower labeled it. In fact, some of their representatives served on some of their boards and so forth. So, it's a very powerful bloc. The right. As the Nixon administration progresses and his war policies generate further opposition, and there's more, it becomes more embedded. It's not just against the war in Vietnam. It becomes a criticism of the militarization of American foreign policy. The over-aggressiveness. I mean, we were even in the early stages of Vietnam. We invaded other countries militarily.
Right.
And we killed 1 million Vietnamese people. So there was a lot of people that said, we got to go deeper and really look at the extent of this influence in our country and these policies and the way they're made. And so Richard Nixon, was determined to try and suppress this, and that's where you really find the origins of the new right. And you'll remember that John Mitchell, his attorney general, said while Nixon was in office, this country is going to go so far to the right that you will not recognize it. They were putting the elements together, and that was the Heritage Foundation, which was begun in Washington, D.C. in the early 70s, and very tied to, I'll just say, agencies of the United States government.
Yeah, and of course Roger Stone was with Nixon back in that period, right?
Yeah. And there were a lot of other folks there who were just wanted to take a very hard authoritarian line against those who didn't agree with them in the United States. I think they thought that they were going to be able to keep Richard Nixon in office, that Watergate wouldn't overtake them, but it did. But again, Watergate, that was clearly a vest pocket operation of CIA operatives who operated out of the Bay of Pigs operation, and that included organized crime figures like Santos Trafficante, included Howard Hunt, and all those people who were straight CIA, and he brought them in to do dirty work because they had worked together. When Nixon was vice president, he was the planning officer for the Bay of Pigs.
I didn't
And
know that. That's really interesting.
the top guy in the administration for that
By the
project.
way, when I was in the Moonies, 74 to 76, we were told to fast for Nixon during Watergate because God wanted him to be president. And
Oh
yours
my.
truly fasted on the Capitol stairs for Nixon, even though I hated Nixon before I had been recruited into the cult.
Yeah, that's an interesting observation, and we should come back to that subject in a few minutes because Nixon loses out in the end, and Jimmy Carter's becomes president in the '76 election because Gerald Ford's pardon didn't rub well with the public, and when Gerald Ford was appointed vice president by Nixon, and then he pardoned Richard Nixon from his crimes. Um, but and then the forces for organizing the new right. You see the emergence of the Jerry Falwell, and his moral majority was founded and named, and people like Paul Weyrich of the Congress for Committee for the Survival of Free Congress, as it was called then, and later called Free Congress Foundation. They they were pulling meetings together of like-minded people from all over and said, we've got to accelerate, we've got to defeat Jimmy Carter. And, and they started, Richard Viguerie started doing all these mass mailings. And through the mass mailings and the money they got back, the donations they got back, which helped fund them, they also saw which issues were the red hot issues for igniting the public opinion,
Mm-hmm.
Panama, the ERA, the Equal Rights Amendment for women, and so forth. And then they geared those fights were the ones they geared up based on that direct mail kind of response.
Yeah, and abortion was another one that wasn't an issue for
Yeah,
the right wing until that they decided we need a hot button issue to press.
that's exactly correct. I should have mentioned that as well. And so they started organizing all this and building their consensus that they were going to back Ronald Reagan to take over because they didn't want a standard kind of Republican. They didn't want a Dole or a standard congressional, some senator to just take the job. They wanted Ronald Reagan, who was a well-known hardliner of the right, and actually had called once for drawing the blood of protesters against the Vietnam War. And they recruited him, and they won the primary and then won the general election against Jimmy Carter, using a lot of the inflamed propaganda things they developed through their direct mail and their own ideological orientations.
Mm-hmm.
And I mentioned Paul Weyrich. Here's another leader of it. His when he talked about his upbringing, he talked about being a Coughlinite, which meant a father Charles Coughlin follower, who ran a ministry out of Detroit, a radio program on CBS radio that reached millions of people. And he was actually doing broadcasts of Hitler's propaganda minister Himmler's speeches. They would send them to the United States, and he would convey the messages that were coming from Nazi Germany into broadcasts of his own.
Oh, I didn't know that. I did write about him in the Cult of Trump and the ministry. The whole propaganda was disinformation was happening, the whole 9 yards.
Yes, and he was still, he was fighting adamantly to keep the United States out of World War II. Conveniently overlooking in the end that it was Germany that declared war on the United States first.
Right.
And the day after the Pearl Harbor attack of December 7th, 1941. And so eventually, since he was a priest, the Catholic Church silenced him. The Catholic Church finally silenced him. He was very overtly anti-Semitic as well. And being in the city with Henry Ford, who was very overtly anti-Semitic and hired people, again, with these kinds of backgrounds that we've described of other people. put a whole propaganda department together and started a newspaper called the Dearborn Independent, which is the city where he was living and had his major factory. And they just heavily propagandized anti-Semitism in the United States, in order to try and keep, not because that was their belief system, I should say.
Right.
And they wanted to keep the United States out of the war. So these are the kinds of people. Coughlin, a guy who openly, decades later says, this is what my influencer was. Reading the writings of Father Coughlin, who hardly wrote anything. It was his broadcast.
Interesting.
And they formed the New Right as it became known, because it was breaking from traditional conservatism. This was not conservatism. This was going post. You had back then. You had evangelists like Billy James Hargis, who were very explicit about repudiating democracy and the Constitution as evil, and they had millions of followers, along with some of the other folks that in a later generation would be called televangelists, but there weren't televangelists back then. Billy Graham was the televangelist of that era.
Yeah.
And of course, he was allied to the Republican Party, but not necessarily to these movements. But this hardline, super hardline, authoritarian, and in some case totalitarian, racially with racial supremacy underpinnings, became the force of the New Right that took over. Now, they didn't openly broadcast all of this to the public that they were directing to or giving the speeches to, but eventually, this is where Pat Robertson and the Jerry Falwells, they all start evolving out of this movement and getting their programs more widely followed and become forces to where Pat Robertson announces the project to take over the Republican Party in 1988 after 8 years of the Reagan administration. Pat Robertson, what he would call his ministry, we could call it his network or so forth, to greatly expanded. They were doing projects in conjunction with the CIA in Central America, in Eastern Europe, and so forth. And so, a lot of money comes in. They was doing projects in Zaire, made tons of money off of the exploitation of mineral resources in Zaire. That was Pat Robertson. But they'll say it was the mom and pop who was mailing in their $10 and $20 donations. That's where his millions came from. Not quite true. So you have all this bubbling up and becoming the forces to take over the governance of the United States without people fully comprehending who they were, what they were, and what the consequences were. Well, eventually, the consequences come home in Donald Trump, and we see what they were, and we see, having a president who openly embraces the paramilitary right and the racial right to challenge the opponents, and he had nothing negative to say. Even in the 70s and 80s, there were many Republican leaders that denounced the armed groups that had formed at the time, the Minutemen, for instance. And the Minutemen openly promoted the assassination of public officials.
Yeah, this is a militia group in the U.S.
Yeah, it was a spin-off of the John Birch Society, although not formally. They came out of it like John Birch influences, that there was this evil power structure and we had to, do this, and that. You can condemn the power structure. That's legitimate. But, if you take the view that we're going to form an army and start killing people because they're not far right wing enough, whether they're in the power structure or on the street. That becomes highly problematic. It was not widely embraced. It was they were investigated, prosecuted. He served time in jail, Robert Depew, for that activity. But in the 1980s, it's a different world. Such is the influence of this stuff that when the so-called militias are formed starting in the 90s, in reaction to another Democrat getting elected, it becomes a big boost for the extreme right. And they bombed the Oklahoma building in the federal Murrah building in Oklahoma City, and people start looking at them again, but not with the depth and the education and the explanation of what this phenomenon is to the general public. And then you have the incidents in Idaho, and the Aryan Nation expands its voice and so forth. And in the meantime, while Reagan is president, the Republican Heritage Groups Council, with these old veterans from World War II on the Nazi side, they're holding their meetings, and they're expanding their work as well.
Mm-hmm.
And just so the readers know, I was attending these meetings. I did attend Aryan Nations meetings, and they
As a journalist.
No.
Oh.
Well, mostly as a journalist, except for the Aryan Nations, because they would have dragged me out the back and shot me. I thought at the time. They were a pretty lethal group, but they held more meetings in Michigan than they did in Idaho, but the press never covered them. And that's a whole nother story. But these groups were meeting, and I tell a story in the book about how a guy who was the head of the Cossack unit of the Heritage Groups Council. I mean, how many Cossack people call themselves Cossacks in the United States? But here we celebrate the Cossack heritage here, right? He showed me his ID as a German officer in a German SS unit, and that he was getting a pension today at that time in the 1980s from the German government for his service to Germany in World War II. Wow. Yeah. So people think that the Germany repudiated the Nazi period, but and it's entirely possible that was being funded as a project of an American intelligence agency. To keep them, but so it can't be traced to a bank in the United States. And he was he spent 7 hours talking to me, and how he was linked up with these Nazi groups, the Liberty Lobby, Thunderbolt, which is a publication of a stormtrooper group, and so forth. Because I started by looking at what is this Coalition for Peace Through Strength, and I wanted to know what these groups were, and I started exploring it. And, I will tell you, Steve, I never expected what I saw.
Right.
So
Russ, we're running out of time a little bit, but I know that in Congress they're trying to create a caucus that seems like a racial identity thing right now.
Yeah, thank you for bringing that right to the point today. There are a handful of Trump-supporting Republicans that are creating something that's being called at this time the Anglo-Saxon Caucus to protect the Anglo-Saxon values. And the Congresswoman Marjorie Greene is seen as a leader of this. Matt Gaetz, I think it is, out of Florida. I don't know how to pronounce his last name.
Gaetz.
Thank you. Out of Arizona. And the Associated Press has done a story on this, by the way. And so, I don't know how many members of the 147 members of the House who will sign on. These are the 147 members who oppose impeaching Trump. and didn't support certifying the election results. How many of them are going to sign on to this? I think Trump will probably, try to press people to become part of it. It may be that something else will be formed with a more obscure name, an Anglo-Saxon caucus, But, so if you're Irish or Polish or Italian, these people say you're not Anglo-Saxon and, you don't count.
Yeah.
Now,
Can I ask a question, Russ?
this out,
So,
yeah.
so, of course, the Germans hated the Soviet Union, but the Soviet Union fell. Putin took power, and Putin has been very deeply involved with Trump. Do you know anything about connections between the white supremacist German cliques and Putin?
Well, a little bit. Initially, Putin didn't come into power until years after the collapse of the Soviet Union.
Right.
You had Boris Yeltsin and kind of a clownish figure, and others before that. In the early years, the first segment of the Putin years, the United States actually had constructive relations with Putin. They were doing joint denuclearization programs. They did this joint space program, the MERS, So you had cosmonauts and astronauts in the space together, and it was all this was joint. They were doing joint initiatives in the Middle East to try and resolve the conflicts in the Middle East.
Mm-hmm.
And then came the Ukraine in 2014, and a guy was elected post Soviet Ukraine was electing people who were being backed by the organization Ukrainian Nationalists, and a lot of those affiliated with that Nazi organization, they started elevating and promoting the founder of it and putting up statues, which would be like in Germany putting up a statue of Hitler. Okay, I mean the guy was a raving lunatic, and they were honoring him, and the presidents were. They started in the Ukraine. They put pensions together for the Ukrainian nationalists who fought the Soviet Union in World War II, which means they fought the Allies. Because if you're fighting the Soviet Union, who's an ally of the United States, you're weakening the Allied forces in favor of the Axis forces.
Right.
Germany was, of course, funding and equipping them to do this, and so that's who comes to power. And then, and of course, they're very anti-Soviet and so forth. So a guy gets elected president who's because a big part of the Ukraine on the east side of it is more, tied with Russia historically, ancient Russia, not talking Soviet Union, but historic Russia, and they weren't anti-Russian. The western part in the Galician Mountains was anti-Russian, and the Ukrainian nationalists made clear throughout their existence that we're not just anti-communist, we're anti-Russian. Okay, we don't like Russians, period, no matter what you call them. And so when this guy got elected with a base in the east, and took a more conciliatory tone and started trying to work out arrangements with both the European Union and Russia, the United States turned against them. And this will be shocking to some people, but the truth is the truth. In 2014, the United States started backing the Ukrainian nationalists in mass demonstrations in Kiev, in the capital, and eventually they forced the government out, and the United States formed a new coalition to run the Ukraine. But the United States was really in control of this story, and there's a lot that could be said about that. But in sum, they were funding this group, and this group was openly in its work wearing Ku Klux Klan insignia and insignia of the German Waffen SS Division, 2nd Waffen SS Division, which operated on the Eastern Front in the Ukraine zone. They were openly identifying themselves as Nazis, and then still promoting their World War II Nazi leader and so forth. And so they organized these demonstrations, burning tires and doing all this sort of stuff in the confrontation. And the United States publicly embraces them. Once this government is collapsed and the United States puts in a new government, a war begins against the people of the East. He said, "We're not recognizing this coup government. This was an overthrow of our elected government," and they started withdrawing and resisting. And the Western Ukrainians basically just started paramilitary operations against them in the East, and that's how the Ukrainian Civil War started. And they were part of it. And so the Ukrainian Nazis were trying to recruit all the European Nazis to come and join like a multinational Nazi military unit. And they were getting some people from from Croatia and Scandinavia and so forth. And the groups that had that orientation in Europe, they weren't pro-Ukrainian or pro-Russian in and of themselves.
I'd like to bring us back to America, if I may, because we're going to need to wrap up soon.
Okay, well, yeah, and so in that case, Putin started making contacts with some of these groups, notably Marie Le Pen of the French National Front, which wasn't paramilitary but was clearly, the embodiment of the closest thing to fascism in France, and the Putin regime started funding them just as the United States was funding the Ukrainian Nazis. And so it became who was going to be allied with the Nazis, because the European left and the peace movement basically was totally collapsed, and they weren't protesting any of this creation of the Civil War. They were all silent. So the only people who that Putin figured out, I'll link up and we'll fight over which Nazis are allied with who, and that, so Putin started putting money on them to a degree that, helped them succeed in what they were doing as well. So both countries were doing this. And it's a disgraceful story on both.
It really is disgraceful. So what's it's 2021, we're rolling out vaccinations for the pandemic, and we're still incredibly polarized in the United States. And what do you think people need to know? What do you think the media needs to know in terms of educating people?
Well, I think, excuse me, I think first of all, getting Donald Trump out of office doesn't mean you've defeated that movement. With Donald Trump out of the office, they are showing even a wider latitude to stay and do crazy things, like suppress the vote, whether it's Georgia or Florida or Michigan.
Right.
Passing these laws, or at least introducing the laws, Georgia and Florida have implemented highly restrictive voting to try and,
Sure.
because they believe there's people who should not be voting in this country.
No, they're elitists. They're racists. We get it.
Tucker Carlson said during the night of the election, Detroit shouldn't be allowed to vote. Because and so they're trying to re-engineer their capacity to suppress the people that they are targeting, to invalidate them in terms of citizens. So they
cancel them, to use their words.
Yeah. And so while that's going on, they're still rebuilding. Now, you have the Pence wing of the party, which is pretty extreme. I mean, you still have the Heritage Foundation and the religious right. I've regarded uh, Mike Pence as a theocrat. You know, he was tied to the DeVos wing of the party, and they're openly theocratic. DeVos has funded groups that propagandized and educated people that as Christianity Today said it in 1987, this was the movement that said democracy is heresy, and they wanted to delegitimize the current system that governed the United
Yeah,
States.
we have to mention Amway is DeVos's money, and Eric Prince is Betsy DeVos's brother, and all the dirty ops.
Yes, yeah, and the DeVosses were tied. Not only was Betsy DeVos the Secretary of Education for Trump, but she was brought in, I think, through Pence, because Pence was able to put some of his people in.
And Pence was recruited into the family by Chuck Colson from Watergate time. The Jeff
Oh, yeah.
Sherlock wrote two great books about the family and the
Yeah,
National Prayer Breakfast and everything.
Oh, okay. That's important to know. And so we're going to have, this Pence force, and he's created this organization, and it's just got dozens of people who were part of the history of this stuff. Not the Heritage Groups Council, the SS people type, but the very extreme right, you know, and so you have them, and then you're going to have the Trumpite right-wing people competing, and so the challenge is going to be in making sure people understand who these represent. And I'm afraid there's a lot of people who think, well, Trump turned on Pence, so he must be okay, and that's highly fallacious, as you know. And we've got to comprehend what are the forces actually trying to control the elections and take over the government, and what is their true agenda. And I think the whole super opposition to COVID, like we experienced it in Michigan, but and elsewhere across the country, you see in Florida, we don't need to do all this social distancing and masking and stuff like this. The governor, DeSantis, and Abbott in Texas and others, because they want to paint the Democrats as creating oppressive conditions to try and condition Americans into being robots and obedient slaves. Oh, you have to have measures to fight the spread of pandemics, and that's been throughout history, right? Look at the pandemic that this country a century ago. It took 3 years to get rid of it. Now we're seeing new variations come in, and they went after the Michigan governor. They're trying to destroy the Michigan governor right now, and they've got 39 bills to change the elections that will make it much more difficult to do absentee voting, because that they feel that that's what helped the margin of victory for the Democrats. And so they're doing that, even though that adversely affects all senior citizens who are the major users of absentee voting. So we have a lot of contemporary challenges coming from the right, and I think there needs to be more dissecting and publishing and public education about where the history of the origins of where these forces come from, whether they're the Pence forces or the Trump forces, and being able to even raise questions about why it is that these groups can go in. Again, in the case of Michigan, they can go into the Capitol with machine guns and get right in the face of police and scream and try and go right into the nobody, even the staff, are not allowed on the House floor during the sessions. Okay, they tried to go during the session, and I was on legislative staff in Lansing for a few years. I never got on the floor of the House while they were in session. Couldn't. And so, how they can do all that and surround and threaten, put nooses up about hanging the governor, and without using her name, with using vulgar mischaracterizations of her names. And nobody sees the problem with that. And thousands of people are called to come and protest the restrictions the governor's putting in. They show up. But when Black Lives Matter protests police violence and murder, people are like, oh, this is a threat to us, and we got to stomp on them, and the police come down heavy on them, And, a kid in Racine, Wisconsin, kills two of the protesters, and the guy is let out on bail to do whatever he wants without restrictions.
Yeah, and they're fundraising to help him as well. It's really awful.
We've got to be able to raise discussions in our education about the disparities where we're tolerating this, paramilitary fascists, some of whom were later busted and arrested for actually plotting to assassinate the governor and plotting to go in and circle the Capitol and kill everybody inside, Republican and Democrat. But the Republicans still act like they're friends with these people.
Yeah, so my former cult, when I was in Moon would say democracy is satanic. We need a theocracy to rule the world, and just a lot of things that I'm hearing today again. And people don't realize the Moonies have a gun factory. They make rifles and machine guns.
Well, the Department of Defense, and I think this was under Ronald Reagan, gave them a license to manufacture AR-15s, also known as M16s, which were used around the world. I think the Moonies were always seen as people who threaten your children, and they'd be out there selling flowers for this bizarre cult leader, but they didn't understand the powerful political machinery behind it.
Exactly.
And I attended conferences of entities that were basically intelligence agency constructs, World Anti-Communist League, which was really something more than anti-communist. It was really totalitarian.
That's Wackel that I asked you about earlier. And Singlaub, I believe, and the Moonies have been deeply involved with the intelligence stuff.
When I went to those meetings, there was a liaison with the National Security Council. This is 1985, Reagan president, a liaison with the National Security Council there at the meetings, coordinating what they were doing with the National Security Council, which means the intelligence agencies of the U.S. government. And the Moonies were representing the Japanese. They were the Japanese chapter of this, and they were on the governing board of this organization. They were very tied into the military intelligence industrial complex of the United States. And that's why when Reagan was president, they were able to receive through conduits we don't know, almost $1 billion that they used for funding right-wing organizations. And they spread it out. They created the Washington Times newspaper in Washington, D.C. with that money. And it was coming through covert operations of the American government. And this is what caused some members of Congress to create the Koreagate investigation. It was all these kinds of suspicious activities. And the congressman who led that, Douglas Fraser, was targeted by the Moonies and successfully defeated in the election, so he wouldn't have the power to do that anymore.
Yeah, and Leo Ryan was assassinated. He was on the committee, too. He was assassinated in Guyana at Jonestown.
By another cult, yeah. But these undercurrents are very powerful forces. And I think in addition to all that we've talked about, to research and expose these, people need to, look at the whole imbalance and the lunacy of what's going on, and reaffirm what freedom means. It's not like I can do whatever I want and punch anybody in the nose. It's there's deeper concepts, and people I think, and I can't explain why. I'm not going to try. Don't have the civics understanding of what the Constitution is and what the rights of all people are, and what that you have rights and you have responsibilities. And these groups that always out there talking about rights, that don't talk about responsibilities, like the NRA and many others, or these militia groups. These, people have to.
100%. I agree with you. There's no free speech without responsible speech. You're not allowed to scream fire in a crowded theater if there's no fire. You're not
Yep.
allowed to punch someone in the nose. You have the freedom
Right.
to raise your arm, but your freedom ends before the nose appears.
Yeah, yeah, and the right wing that we're dealing with now, which the Republican part, major elements of the Republican Party are allied with, are with the people that believe that if you're not with us, you need to be punched in the nose, you need to be suppressed, you need to be invalidated as a voter. This is the embryonic fascism.
Yep.
And and
I'd
the
say it's past
ideology.
embryo stage. I'd say it's
Yeah,
pretty
yeah,
malignant
yeah.
at this
Yeah,
point.
it's in its eighth month of pregnancy, isn't it? And we we need that kind of work going on as well with Americans. And I don't know how you convince 41% of Republicans that believe that Donald Trump won the election that he didn't. But you got to quit believing this mysterious QAnon guy that nobody knows who it is. It's obviously
Well,
a man.
we think we know Michael Flynn was involved and a number of other disaffected military
Yeah,
intelligence people who know how to do psyops were
yeah,
involved
yeah.
with it.
Right, and I believe that's exactly right. That's why there's
Yeah.
no one. But they'll believe something that has no name associated with it, and they'll believe Donald Trump when he says something, and they won't believe tens of thousands of elected city clerks and elected officials and auditors who say the election didn't have any marked fraud in it at all.
Yeah,
There's
no,
no.
this is my expertise, Russ, brainwashing and mind control and how people
Yeah.
can be programmed with just crazy beliefs and be
Uh-huh.
short-circuited from any type of reality testing due to
Uh,
phobias and thought stopping and all types of loaded language and manipulation techniques. We're going to need to wrap up. But I wonder if
okay.
you have any last words before I hit the stop button.
Uh, just that the threat to the democracy that we believe we have is not going away. It's growing and expanding. It doesn't need Donald Trump in the White House to do that. And look at all the candidates who are running, and hold your elected officials accountable, especially if you're in a Republican era. What was your relationship with these paramilitaries and these people who are trying to discredit the elections and so forth? Are you really representing the people, or are you on an ideological agenda
Good question.
and start look at your own elected officials and start holding them accountable if they're part of any of this.
Thank you, Russ Bellant, so much. You've done so many important research projects and writing, and your voice is much needed. And by the way, in my research with QAnon, white supremacist neo Nazis are very present. Same server as QAnon a number of times as well. So we know
Uh-huh.
that there's definite linkage right there in
Well,
terms of it.
and I'd appreciate anything that you've published on that subject, or any research you're willing to share. Because
Yeah, my website, I have many blogs about QAnon, and of course, I wrote The Cult of Trump. But I'm going to
right.
need to go now. But thank you so much,
Thank you,
Russ.
Steve. I appreciate catching up with you again. Take care, buddy.
Thank you.